Hello, Super Context listeners. I'm going to interrupt the credit music real quick just to let you know. We are a Patreon-supported podcast, and one of the rewards that we offer to our supporters is a shadow podcast called Super King Context. Once a month, we do a special Super Context on a Stephen King film or television adaptation. Our first Super King Context was released a year ago on Halloween. And since it's been a year, we felt like now would be a great time to let all of our listeners have a chance to hear it. This is our episode on Brian De Palma's film, Carrie. Since this one, we've done episodes on the films Dreamcatcher, Creepshow, 1408, Cujo, The Dead Zone, Cat's Eye, Christine, Misery, and Children of the Corn, along with the television adaptations of The Mist, Salem's Lot, and The Stand. Check out patreon.com/supercontext to see how you can get access to the rest of our Super King Context series, and I hope you enjoy this special release, re-release, repost, sneak peek. I don't know. Call it what you like. Okay, back to the show.
Welcome to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How we consume it and how it informs our everyday culture.
I'm Christian Sager, a writer and a designer.
And I'm Charlie Bennett, a librarian and a radio raconteur.
Each episode is us trying to understand the entertainment world that we all live in.
Just a little bit better.
This episode of Super King Context is about the 1976 film Carrie. We discuss how Stephen King's first novel was adapted into a cautionary movie about adolescence, bullying, and female representation by a bunch of middle-aged men.
Hello.
We also ask, how does the male gaze impact a story that is so often referred to as feminist?
You can follow along with blood-soaked show notes at supercontextpodcast.libsyn.com, and you can write us an email. Did you see this edited? Did you see it raw and uncut? At supercontextpodcast@gmail.com.
So I watched Carrie last night, and the whole way through, I kept thinking about you and your daughters. And I kept
That's gross.
Kept thinking,
always gross when you say it.
Man, there's a real fine line between being a parent and being a monster.
There's a line from the sitcom Scrubs. Of course we cause psychological damage on our children. I understand that that's the most fun you have parenting.
As we can hear your children screaming in the
background.
background.
Can you hear that? Yeah. That one I'll leave in.
Yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if you did not hear the practically on cue shout, the crew, my ragtag crew of Bennett's, is gathering itself up to head out into the brave wide world, and one of them, I think Atticus, is learning how to scream. He's been practicing his yells.
Nice.
He actually puts his hands over his ears and sees how loud he can get.
It's because you played Neurosis in the house that one time.
I waited till they were in bed. I guess that's why I hated it, right? Because I played it at kids are in bed volume instead of raw volume. Okay. So, yes, I also thought about parenthood for most of my rewatch of Carrie, which was not how I remembered it. You know?
I had a revelation. I have never seen the unedited version of Carrie all the way through until now. I always watched it on...
Meaning television?
Yeah, I always watched it on television growing up. And so I had never seen the intro scene with the credits where the girls are all naked in the locker room picking on Carrie because of her period. I've never seen that until now. The
you
version
just filled
I
in the
saw,
blanks because you'd read the novel?
No, and I've never read the novel. It was just, because they opened it up with her at the principal's office explaining what happened in the locker room. So I just pieced it together. And I think over the years, I've seen so many clips pulled for various reasons that I just, I filled in the blanks. But last night I was like, oh, there is a version of this movie I've never seen. I didn't realize Sissy Spacek was naked in the beginning.
There's a version of this movie, meaning the movie.
The movie, yeah.
You've never seen the movie.
Yeah, exactly. Because it was always on television growing up. I think that's how I mainly watched it. And then probably like popped in on other people watching it and watched the last 20 minutes.
And yet it is so fundamental to how you think of things. That they're all going to laugh at you is just running in your head all the time.
All the time. My wife quotes Carrie on a regular basis. She says they're all going to laugh at you all the time. And the other one is we cite Piper Laurie from this movie a lot. She says, "I can see your dirty pillows." That's the other line from this movie my wife thinks is hilarious. But
now, do you think that the PJ Harvey line, "Take those dirty pillows away from me," is that a Carrie reference?
I don't know. I mean, I've never heard dirty pillows outside of the connotation of this film before, but it cracks me up every time. It is a classic line. I've never heard anyone else refer to breasts like that. But
right.
Yeah, Carrie is just like a part of my archetypal subconscious, and I think that is a perfect lead-in for why we're doing this thing, right? So, like, this is a special version of Super Context that only our Patreons will be able to hear, and we're gonna
actually it's pronounced Patreon.
Oh, is that right? There's an accent,
like Pinchon, yeah.
There is like a Stephen King's like career is embedded in my subconscious because of his impact on popular culture. And yes, like anybody who's listened to Super Context before knows that both you and I are children of Uncle Stevie. You know, we grew up with this stuff. But Carrie, I think, is different in that I think it's pervasive. It's in the American subconscious, you know? Like everybody knows the bucket of blood getting dropped on a girl at the prom, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, everybody has, and also I think the hand coming out of the ground.
Right.
Like there's some indelible imagery.
That's another thing I just remembered. Next to our bed, next to my wife's side of the bed, she has a illustrated print hung up that is one of the drag queens from RuPaul's Drag Race. I believe it's Raja, pouring a bucket of blood on her own head in an episode where she did a Carrie homage.
Right.
So it's just like, it's everywhere.
So we buried the lead. This is a patron-only episode of Not Quite Super Context. This is an episode of the series we're calling Super King Context. It's only for folks who are supporting us. It is going to be mostly like Super Context. I mean, we're not going to radically change the format, but we might be a little less, hey, if this is your first time listening.
Right, because presumably if you're at this level as a Patreon, then you know how this whole thing works, and you're interested in hearing this.
I just had this vision of a stupid joke I made turning into a thing that we say every time. I feel like maybe we should cut out that Pinchon joke right now.
Well, now whenever I hear it, I go to Drag Race, I hear Alaska Thunderfuck going, Patreon.
I love it. So Super King Context is only the adaptations of Stephen King's mostly novels and stories. This is our attempt to track all of the adaptations of the Stephen King works that have so formed us, transformed us, and warped us, and how they were made mostly into movies and sometimes into TV.
And some of these we haven't seen before, surprisingly enough, but like this one, I was like, okay, should we start chronologically? And we both looked and we were like, well, Carrie's the first one. We should obviously do Carrie because it's one of the most
novel,
successful
first
ones.
Adaptation.
Yeah.
It is a big part of a lot of people's psyche, whether or not they saw the whole movie.
Yeah. So Patreons, if you're listening,
it's in.
Hey, let us know in the feedback about this episode how you think we should proceed. So we were talking about doing it chronologically, meaning every adaptation over time. But if there's one that you all really want to hear, you really want us to get to, we don't have any problem jumping around. It's just kind of arbitrary, I think, at this point, like what direction we go in.
Yeah, I'd feel comfortable saying that if someone says, hey, will you do this one? That kind of pops it up the list almost to the next one we record.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, they just dumped a whole bunch of Stephen King adaptations on Amazon Prime, so I added them all to my queue.
You're gonna do some homework that you like doing for once.
Oh, I like most of the stuff we do. And I think it's going to be fair to say that you and I are not going to like 90% of these movies. I mean, there's a reason why most of them are thought of as being bad, and most adaptations of King's work are considered bad.
Yeah. But I am actually looking forward to carving a space out again in my head for horror.
What's the one that you're looking forward to watching that you haven't seen?
A couple. It is actually one that I'm looking forward to.
Oh, the new It or
the new It? Yeah.
That is
because that's going to scare the bejesus out of me.
Yeah, it's a good movie too. We just rewatched it on HBO. It was real good.
Yeah, and also I'll never forget that Stephen King said that he likes the movie version of Cujo. Oh, that's a movie that just keeps on punching.
Cujo is one of those that I haven't seen since it came out. Since I was like 5 and it was on television or something.
Yeah. And there's also a few that I'm looking forward to because they're terrible. For instance, Silver Bullet. Right?
Oh, I love Silver Bullet.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's not lovable.
Yeah. But it's a bad movie.
Yeah, it's pretty rough, right? And and another one just jumped right out of my head.
Maximum Overdrive?
Well, no, Maximum Overdrive is one of the finest pieces of cinema.
We've established that it's better than some of Godard's work.
Okay. Well, let's buckle down. I do want to say that we threw a lot of little references there at the beginning. This movie is so much about bullying and the way that parents fuck up their children, on purpose or by accident, and also parent surrogates. That threw me for a loop watching it. And also, it's been a while since I watched a Brian De Palma movie that was well made. Right? Like well crafted. Because some of his recent ones have just been like, you've got to be fucking kidding me, dude.
I don't think I've seen any of his movies in the last 10 years. Like, I never watched The Black Dahlia or any of those thrillers that he did in the mid 2000s. Well,
this is exactly what I'm talking about. There was this weird kind of stretch of Brian De Palma making movies just like he makes movies.
Yeah.
But it just not working at all.
Yeah.
Right? But Carrie was this remarkable reminder of how his particular kind of crazy, his particular weird eye, right, made some incredibly striking, memorable movies that were good. Even if they looked a little too much like a porn film.
Yeah, there we go. That was what I was getting at.
Yeah.
This guy's definitely got the male gaze in his director's vision. And it's especially weird in this film because of the subject matter and because, I think as a society talk about Carrie as if it's like a feminist parable. But, but this movie is anything but.
And that's the weirdest thing about Carrie all through its creation is that, a guy wrote the book, a guy wrote the screenplay, a guy directed the movie.
Yep.
It retains some of that feel, though, of, this is about women and how they are handled and how they can be who they want to be or how they're stopped. And yet it's like a double bluff in a way.
It's about how middle-aged men in the 70s thought that women were oppressed.
Yeah. Yeah. So we got a lot to dig into and a lot to make fun of. Carrie is a 1976 horror film, directed by Brian De Palma, based on Stephen King's 1974 novel. That's Stephen King's first novel, his remarkably successful first novel.
Yeah.
And it's so funny to read this description, this log line.
I wrote this because I was like, I got to come up with like a 120 characters description of what this movie is.
But it's so perfect. It's about a telekinetic high school girl going through puberty and dealing with bullying.
That's the basic gist of it. The other thing that I realized rewatching it is there is not a lot of meat on the bone with this. It is pretty much a short story. with padding. And then when I was reading how they adapted the script, they thought the same thing. Apparently, in the book version, he uses that technique where he has like a lot of like newspaper clippings about events that happened. And
it's a record of a real life event as much as he can make it.
Yeah, and they felt like that was padding out what is essentially a short story.
So tell me what that means to you. I mean, obviously the phrase, not a lot of meat on the bone, yeah. But what does that mean to you in terms of the movie? You felt like it was too long, or you felt like it was simple? What was the thing that...
The plot is just very straightforward. You know, I mean, the plot is this.
Yeah.
This girl gets her period. All of the girls in her class make fun of her for it. She has a repressive, zealot religious mother at home. One of the girls in her class tries to be nice and has her boyfriend ask her out to the prom. They go to the prom. The bullies pick on her and drop a bucket of blood on her. She freaks out and uses her telekinesis to kill everybody.
Yeah.
That's the plot.
It is so much the Dan Harmon story circle, where instead of going back to your familiar place changed after you get what you want, it's get what you want, have it taken away, and thus cannot go back to your familiar place, right?
Yeah.
And anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about, Dan Harmon, the showrunner for Community and co-creator of Rick and Morty, he has sort of done a mathematical analysis of story structure and how people use the hero's journey and all that stuff. And so he has these things called story circles. If that even remotely interests you, I advise you to Google it and find his series of blog posts about the story circle. He gets into overwhelming detail, and it's actually really useful. But putting that against Carrie, it's a reminder of a really good horror story, right, is a tragedy.
Yeah.
You know, it follows the heroic path until it doesn't.
Right. You and I were talking about this before we recorded. My take on Carrie is that it's Stephen King's X-Men book, right? Like, this is Stephen King reading an X-Men comic and being like, oh, what if I told the origin of Jean Grey, but I just put my horror spin on it? And it's essentially that, right? And then when you look at his work, you realize, like, oh, like, actually a lot of his stories are, you know, what if X teenager with Y superpower got too angry?
Yeah. Because there's somebody with telepathy, there's somebody with telekinesis, there's someone with pyrokinesis.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm missing the last big one.
Dead Zone.
Yeah, right. And then someone with clairvoyance. And those are then intercut with
and I think
stories.
The kid from the Talisman counts. Like, he's a kid who can jump back and forth between dimensions.
Oh, he's Legion.
Yeah, sure. Right? Like they're just various like X-Men origin stories with a dash of horror thrown on top of them.
Well, that certainly suits the 70s, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of, oh boy, this was the 70s all the way through. John Travolta and William Catt were in there, looking like teenagers.
Yeah.
Nancy Allen, who I kind of didn't remember was like a part of some of the most important pieces of my, early 80s.
She's RoboCop's partner.
Yeah, right. And she was in Blowout, and in Carrie. And then Sissy Spacek, who I guess is either a time traveler or an immortal, because she looks exactly the same now as she did back then.
There is something timeless about Sissy Spacek and how at such a young age she had so much gravitas.
And she had already established that, because this was 3 years after she'd appeared in Badlands, which might be Terrence Malick's best movie.
I love Badlands. That's one of my recommendations for this episode. Yeah, I mean...
Martin Sheen is fantastic.
That's a phenomenal film, yeah. But yeah, I mean, she had essentially... The thing that's easy to forget is you might think, because she's so small, oh, she was an actual teenager when they shot this. She was like 26 years old and married. And so she had already been in films. She already had like a television and commercial career. And her husband was the one who turned her on to this movie. He was the art director on the film. So, it's just interesting to see how we sort of retroactively think of Carrie as being, the the seminal like Sissy Spacek work, but she'd been doing stuff for a while before this.
Yeah, and I was remiss not to also mention Piper Laurie as a big part of the '70s when I was saying all these people, in a Brian De Palma movie, that everything from the shorts that the girls wear in their PE class up to the hairstyles, and then just the whole muscle cars and frilly prom suit shirts and all this stuff. It was just like, I wonder if Linklater has ever thought about remaking the film.
Carrie? I mean, I think he probably feels like he already did this, his version of this.
Yeah.
But like, for me, what was interesting is I was born in 1977. So this movie came out a year before I was born. And it really, cemented for me, like I saw it and I was like, oh, all of this is familiar because like, presumably when I came out of the womb, this is what people were dressed like, and these are the cars people are driving, and the way they talked. It was
what you were absorbing as you went.
Yeah. So it was all very familiar, but also, very 70s. We are maybe 12 years away in this film from Piper Laurie dressing up like a Chinese businessman in Twin Peaks. So this is we're really getting Piper Laurie at her finest in this film.
Okay. Well, let's go back to the source real quick. One thing we're going to assume in doing Super King Context is that we're not going to do a biography of Stephen King every time.
Yeah.
We're not going to summarize Stephen King and his effect on literally everything that's important to us. But we're going to try and talk about the moments in his life that generated the work that's being adapted. So he was 26 years old when this all started happening, which is insane to think about.
Because the Stephen King narrative goes like this. Oh, he had struggled writing for so long, and he had all these menial, horrible jobs and was raising a family, and then he found success. And it's like, well, he was 26 years old. Like,
well, he'd been struggling for about 5 years, right? Like,
yeah.
He and Tabitha got married young. So just for some context on inflation, they bought the rights to Carrie for $2,500.
For the film, yeah, they bought the rights from him and the publisher, I guess. But the paperback rights for the book sold for $400,000 to Signet Books. That goes to show you the difference between, like, at the time, how much a movie was worth versus the actual rights to the story.
And especially a B movie. Just like, let's just do a quick horror flick, for the drive-ins. Now, it's also important to think about how, the book sold in hardback and, it was like, yay, published and it was a success. But it wasn't until the paperback rights went up for auction that it was really clear that Carrie had made a impact on everyone, right? That $400,000 in 1975, probably. That's a ton of fucking money.
Yeah.
So by the time this movie was being made, it was clear that Carrie was a really important book, even if it was just important to shake up, as Ramsey Campbell said, the horror field like a bomb.
Right, and we've talked about this in many episodes before, like the impact that Stephen King had, but also that, like, there were lots of people writing horror like this, but, because of where he was and his talent at the same time as the paperback market boom happening, it just really, like Campbell says, it really influenced that genre.
I see that you have put Jeff Vandermeer into our notes.
Our old buddy Jeff keeps popping up. So Vandermeer also talked about Carrie, the book, and he said it helped usher in a boom period of huge popularity for horror fiction. And then he also said that he thinks that it's a strange, unusual book that's uncompromising. I'd agree with that. But yeah, so this book really had an impact, which subsequently led to, people going, whoa, we gotta make it into a movie then, But this is also Vandermeer, I think. He says it brought together a series of strands. Stephen King's discovery while working as a janitor at a high school one summer that girls' showers had curtains. An article in Life magazine suggesting that some poltergeist activity might be telekinetic phenomena, and his memories of two girls at his own school who were both dead, who formed the character of Carrie White.
This is a legendary part of the origin story for Carrie, but he wrote up a first draft, the beginning of a first draft, and then threw it away.
Yeah, I ended up cutting a lot of that out of here. But yeah, he threw it away. He hated it. And Tabitha King convinced him to go back to it.
His wife pulled it out of the trash and said, I think you've got something here and you need to develop it. And everything changed after that. All right, now we come to the movie itself. Brian De Palma is the director of the film adaptation of Carrie. He is very famous to everyone, even if you don't know his name, because he's made a couple movies that are, like Carrie, just part of the general culture. He's the guy who made Scarface. He made the new Mission Impossible. He made Snake Eyes. Oh, wait. That's not really...
Is that the Nicolas Cage Snake Eyes?
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing I think about him for is Phantom of the Paradise, which came out before this.
Until these notes were put together.
Whoa, you got to watch that. That movie's nutso.
You know, I just sort of wiped out all of his pre-Carrie stuff, right? Like he was doing movies as a film student in the early 60s. And he did a bunch of like weird ass, maybe you'd call them kitchen sink realism, right? Like Hi Mom and something about the rabbit, like these weird comedies that were kind of almost like Philip Roth novels.
Yeah, he had a bizarre sensibility, which is why I think it makes sense that they attached him to Carrie. Or rather maybe that he attached himself to Carrie, as we're going to find out. So
Yeah, but he had started to really lean on his Hitchcock influences by the time he got to the late 70s. Like that's the kind of movie he wanted to make after he'd established himself as a director and screenwriter who could get movies done.
And nowadays we think of him as like, this is the guy who's known for doing psychological thrillers, but he was at the time a part of that like new Hollywood group of directors, with Lucas, Spielberg, Scorsese, guys like that. In fact, one thing I learned in the research for this film was cast simultaneously with Star Wars, which led to some interesting casting stories.
This is that extraordinary thing about the new wave of American cinema in the 70s. Most of the directors that we think of as these huge blockbuster directors, really famous, they were all buddies because of the film schools they went to and then the studio systems that they were still working in.
Yeah, so De Palma says he had a friend who was a writer who read Carrie, and they suggested the book to him. And then this friend was also friends with Stephen King, so they apparently put them in touch somewhere around 1975. He found out that nobody had bought the rights to this and that a lot of studios were considering it. So he called around and he said, look, I want to do it. So they bought the rights to the movie. We already established it was only $2,500. I think like nowadays this film would be called an independent film. The budget was $1.8 million. They shot it in 50 days. And De Palma's own words, he says, everything worked except in the book stones hit the house. So they tried to shoot this scene at the end where like I think Carrie pulled rocks in that flew at the house and made it collapse on itself. And they couldn't make that work. There's a long story about it. I don't know if we need to get into it, but essentially there were things they had to leave out of the movie.
And the malfunction actually turned into the eventual scene. Like the way it collapsed turned out to be pretty good for something else.
Yeah. So De Palma talks later and he's like, a lot of people look at my films and they keep saying that I do things in the horror genre, but I don't really think of my movies as horror. He says, I think of the movies with vampires and Frankenstein in them as being horror films.
Right. But he chops people up. That's the thing about De Palma, right? Like his Dress to Kill and Body Double really are like gross revisionings of Hitchcock movies. Psycho and Vertigo are essential parts of these two slasher flicks that he made. Carrie, buckets of blood and people dying.
Travolta like sledgehammer kills pigs in this movie. It's nasty. He like bludgeons pigs to death with his bare hands.
But it says something about 70s cinema that De Palma was saying, that's not horror. This is something else. You know, this is not Christopher Lee. We're doing something else. We're doing some kind of weird realism.
So like I mentioned, like him and Lucas were pals. They were both looking for young actors at the time for these two movies. So they held their casting sessions together, and he said they both wanted Amy Irving, and he wanted to cast Amy Irving as Princess Leia. And so there was this struggle over Amy Irving, and then Amy Irving ended up not playing either of the lead roles. She ended up playing the friend role of Sue Snell. But originally, De Palma wanted Amy Irving to be Carrie, and George Lucas wanted her to be Princess Leia. So it's interesting when you watch the film now and you watch how much attention is paid to the Sue Snell character, you realize like De Palma had kind of a fixation on this actress.
Right. She was important enough that she might have been the center of the film.
After we watched the film last night, my wife was looking up old pictures, and she found a photo of Amy Irving, Carrie Fisher, and Terry Garr sitting around drinking and smoking cigarettes together.
Well, I would watch that for 3 hours.
Right. So they held these joint things, and so Carrie Fisher almost ended up playing the role as Carrie, which might have been a different film as well. It's just wild when you think about how they cast this. We'll have various notes on this, but essentially Sissy Spacek came in and auditioned for like multiple roles, and it was only after
for all the speaking roles that a young actress could play. And her husband, is it Jack Fisk?
Yeah,
Fisk was saying that he was watching Brian De Palma kind of prepare this movie, and he said, I think you should get in there. And I don't know if he actually pushed. I don't know if he had enough weight, right, to actually push Sissy Spacek into the role. But he definitely helped her figure out how to prepare best for her Carrie audition, which, from what I understand, she went in looking crazy.
She like put Vaseline in her hair and stuff to make herself look, like disheveled.
Yeah, and wore like a little kid's dress.
Yeah. And Fisk also talks about how De Palma at the time prepped his movies. He storyboarded everything, but he did it on 3x5 cards. So he thought about each shot, and then instead of having one big storyboard, he just had like this pile of cards that he would go through sequentially. He's like, this is a shot, this is the shot, this is the shot.
He's such a weird guy. The more I learn about how he approached this stuff. So William Friedkin, who directed The Exorcist, right?
Yeah.
He always says, everything I've done in my career was to try and make a movie as good as Citizen Kane.
Okay.
That was like his stars to shoot for. De Palma appears to be going after some Hitchcock movie I'm trying to make a movie as good as one of these Hitchcock movies.
Yeah.
But then also he does all of these very strange things if Hitchcock is the guy that you're trying to emulate. You know what I mean?
I do, yeah. There are definitely tics that you can see in Carrie if you know what you're looking for that this guy had. And I think we've already brought some of this up. Like, this guy's got a lecherous
for sure,
male gaze to the way he angles cameras and positions his actresses.
It's interesting that we'll talk about the split screen later, but much of the movie is either elongating a quick moment or packing a moment that goes fast, with as much information as possible, right? And those drawn out sequences are mostly buildups, right? And especially the long slow motion pan across a insanely full and male fantasized locker room, right?
The locker room scene in this reminded me of like Porky's, or like one of those movies, I can't remember what it was, where like a kid gets the ability to turn invisible and the first thing he does is go in the girls' locker room. Like that's how it was shot.
Yeah, like kind of steamy and smoky and slow, and all the women are clearly delighted to be naked.
Oh yeah, they love being naked next to each other and giggling, and they're almost having like pillow fights. It's kind of gross that all these actresses were told to do this, One of the notes in here later on is that PJ Souls, of all people, managed to keep her top on. There was she was like, this was my first movie and I didn't want to be naked in it. I didn't want my parents to see me naked in it. And then a couple years later, she goes and does Halloween.
Yeah, and this, the scene is very much like one of those sexploitation flicks if they had a budget and someone who could talk a good game about how to shoot something.
So yeah, but when you talk to these folks about the making of this movie, Fisk talks constantly about how he had no money to do anything and that this was the lowest budget shitty movie that he'd ever worked on. And also, I think it's important for you and I, doing the Super King context on this, to realize, this is the kind of shit that was embedded in our heads of, oh, that's what a girl's locker room is like. Or, you know what I mean? This was the presentation to young men in the 70s and 80s of,
I can say now that it's a little gross and a little weird, but I know that whenever the first time I saw that was, and I don't remember when it was, but the first time I brought the video home and watched that, I was probably very into it.
Totally,
I was probably grossly into it, yeah.
Yeah, so it goes to say a lot about how pop culture influences, gendered expectations. So we got this guy Cohen who wrote the script, and there's not a ton of notes here. His name's Lawrence D. Cohen, but he essentially stumbled into the job. He himself says because the producer Paul Monash had optioned the film rights. So it sounds like, all right, let me see if I can piece this together here because nobody's really talking about the money. Sounds like De Palma wanted to do the movie, so he went to Paul Monash, who had the money, and they optioned the rights from Stephen King. And then they worked up the $1.6 million to shoot this small film. And then they hired Lawrence Cohen to do the screenplay.
And Lawrence Cohen essentially says that he had tried to make it happen with some other producer and then was lucky enough to be around when the actual option went through and probably was able to speak well to how he would adapt it, right? Because he had been prepping it in his head.
And there's also an interesting bit here from Cohen. The screenplay did not really define who got killed and how they got killed in the prom sequence. That was all based on what they had available to them and how they shot it. So he says, as for choosing who would live or die, Brian didn't decide that until the last minute. We wanted to maximize the characters that had figured prominently into Carrie's story.
Yeah, so Cohen talks about how he wrote a script that sort of just pulled the story out of the book. They didn't do newspapers or talking heads trying to tell the story of what happened. He just wrote the story of the book in a script. But then when Brian De Palma was going to be the director, it had to get sort of thinned out or stripped down to become, here's the quote, a leaner, meaner scream machine, right? Without being just a slasher flick, without just being a boo kind of movie. And so that probably took a lot of little details out of the script and also opened up chances for this scene went a different way than it said in the script. So now this character is important or this character is not important.
I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to work up the chutzpah to actually sit down and do this, but there are two other versions of Carrie that have been adapted, and I do kind of wonder how much license does each director put into that, right? The latest version was 4 years ago, the one with Julianne Moore and Chloe Grace Moretz, and it I've seen shots from that where clearly they used a ton of CGI at the end, and they were like, oh, the advantage we have over De Palma's is that we can have her do all this crazy X-Men stuff,
right? A DC style explosion at the end.
Yeah, right? And I think in the book she burns the whole town down, and I think they do that in that version of the film too. So it is weird, right? Because this film is essentially the first third is just everybody picks on Carrie. The second third is trying to turn it around, and some people are trying to be nice to Carrie while the others are building up to the big showdown.
It's the Lifetime movie, right? Where a bullied kid connects with someone who feels guilty about their part in the bullying, and then that person tries to help the bullied child.
Yeah, and what is essentially like, the big like final scene is like 30 or 40 minutes long in this movie. They really draw out the final prom scene.
Well, that's the spectacle, right?
Yeah.
That's the payoff of all of this.
And one of the things I didn't realize before doing the research on this is that the two scenes that are shot in slow motion are the scene at the prom and the scene in the locker room. Like they're the scenes with the most impact emotionally, but like they could have happened in half the amount of time.
Right. And I do want to point out that the prom scene, the big prom massacre, right? It's slow motion when it builds up to it, right? It's
right, yeah.
Everything that leads up to the moment that the explosion happens is slow motion and creepy and Hitchcockian.
And they also split the screen, too, which helps to cut down on the time. I imagine that the original cut was probably even longer for this final scene.
We're talking a little bit about sort of the preparation, right? The fact that some work went into this that was more than just a B movie, just more than just a horror film.
Mm-hmm.
And that's in the performances, too. And Sissy Spacek, PJ Souls has this story. She says, Sissy came over to a group of us, maybe at lunch, I don't remember, and said, I love you. We're going to have a great shoot. I'm very excited to be working on this. But I just want to let you guys know, I'm going to alienate myself from you. I want to feel that alienation. But I really like you, and afterwards we'll party and we'll have a great time. So she was method acting.
Yeah. Down to the point that is actually her hand at the end of the movie popping up out of the grave under the rocks of where her house was. Amy Irving later on said that Sissy insisted that it was her own hand, and they actually put her half in and half out of the rock pile. Brian De Palma later on talks about how he was like, look, I'll just get a stunt person. Why do you want to be buried underground? And she's like, no, I have to be the one who does this. So he was like, fine, if you're going to do it, I'm going to make your husband be the one who buries you. So they had him put all the rocks on top of her.
So that's Sissy Spacek. Let's talk about the other huge presence.
Oh, Piper Laurie. Man alive, Piper Laurie. So I recommend, if anybody's really into this film, there's 2 episodes of the podcast I Was There Too that Matt Gorley hosts that are great for behind the scenes on this. He has a Piper Laurie episode and he has a PJ Souls episode. And
nice.
The Piper Laurie episode, she's just basically like, yeah, look, like I came into this movie and I read the script and I was like, oh, this is a farce, right? It's like this is a comedy. Nobody actually talks like this. So she purposely played up the character as like a comedic bit. She wasn't going for horror. She was like, this is a ludicrous satire, right?
She got campy.
Yeah.
But she's also Piper Laurie.
So she's fucking
it turned
terrifying.
into something else. Yeah.
Yeah.
Brian De Palma said that they essentially cast her against type and also against the assumptions of the character in the book. Carrie's mom is this deeply religious, anti-sex, anti-body, sort of anti-pleasure person. Yeah. But instead of a dried-up old lady, as he says, a dried-up old crone, it was Piper Laurie, who is beautiful and voluptuous and red-haired and just like full of life, and then also played it bombastically.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the thing to remember here too, this comes up in that I Was There Too interview. She had stopped working. She had like been pretty successful, I think, in like the late 60s. And then she basically was like, I'm just going to go like work on my home. I think she was like doing gardening or something. I don't know. But she was interested in acting again. So somebody went to De Palma and was like, hey, you should think about getting Piper Laurie. The film that she was mostly known for was The Hustler. Which
have you seen that movie?
I haven't. That's with Paul Newman. Is that right?
Paul Newman, Jackie Gleason.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, she really had a reputation and they pulled her back into the industry for this, which worked out because she ended up getting an Academy nomination for it.
And she kept working after this, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing I mainly know her for other than this is Twin Peaks. But sure, Piper Laurie kept working.
Now, we also mentioned Nancy Allen, who I I guess was very important to young pubescent me.
Okay, this is bizarre to me, okay? Not just to you, but like I always thought of Nancy Allen as being kind of like the drab sidekick because of
Really?
RoboCop. Yeah, I never thought of her as being sexy growing up. And so then to find out like in this and many other movies, she was like this sexy character who gives John Travolta a blowjob in his car and all this stuff. Like, that was weird to me. And then I find out that on the set of this movie, she was flirting it up with Brian De Palma, and that then they got married afterwards and then subsequently divorced. But yeah, I never thought of Nancy Allen as being like an object of sexual identification.
So here's the interesting thing about that and how it sort of expands to the rest of Carrie. Carrie is hugely influential and hugely remembered, right? But all of that surrounding stuff really isn't. You know?
Well, that's the thing is I think it's all in our subconscious, you know?
Well, but like people don't say, "Oh yeah, Nancy Allen."
Right. Oh, remember Nancy Allen and Carrie? Right.
Except I'm sure the people who were living through that period of time do.
Probably.
Right?
Yeah.
But then Carrie, it's like it is elevated out of the stream of studio system that it's in. Not so much for the craftsmanship, right? Like it's well done, so that helps it, but it's almost like the same thing as what happened with Stephen King. It was a lotto ticket that was won, you know?
Yeah, no. And so like I'm just going to Google photos of Nancy Allen and see what comes up. So they're mostly pictures of her nowadays. The top row is RoboCop. But like I see all these photos in what I thought was like 80s mom. Like I always thought of her as being this momish character actress. But you had a different experience. I think cuz you're a couple years older than me. Like she was like sexy.
Yeah. Yes, she was. And how dare you?
This probably explains why you have kids and I don't. Like you were attracted to the lady who looked like a mom.
Wow, Nancy Allen made me fertile. Okay, I'm going to get a T-shirt. You are a big fan of Don't Look Now.
I am. I like Don't Look Now a lot. We've talked about it before. I can't remember when or why, but we did.
Well, it runs through all this stuff that we like, you know, and I mean, Donald Sutherland's in it. But the reason I bring it up is because an Italian composer, always a key part of the 70s movies that are great.
Yeah, so this guy Pino Donaggio did the score for this film and the score for Don't Look Now. You know, I had never really thought about the score to this movie before we sat down to watch it for this. I was watching it last night and I was like, yeah, okay. Like for a horror movie, this guy definitely did some like kooky stuff. There's definitely some, and it makes sense that he's Italian. There's some like giallo kind of like stylings to the soundtrack. And like, you know, every time she uses her telekinesis, there's the like, what, like noise or whatever. That we now kind of think of as like Jason hunting somebody through the woods or something.
Yes, all that. But also he was the guy that Brian De Palma wanted because Bernard Herrmann was dead.
Yeah, so he wanted him. He was recommended, let's see. Oh, a friend of his who is a film critic at Time Magazine recommended Pino Donaggio. So yeah, I mean, he did the soundtrack to Don't Look Now as well. I'd barely remember that. I like Don't Look Now, but I don't really think of it for the soundtrack. So I guess what I'm thinking of here is like this week I went and saw Prince of Darkness played live, and Alan Howarth did a concert afterwards where he performed a live medley of all the music he scored for Carpenter films.
Very cool.
Yeah, it was great. And like that is a composer who like I've got glued into my mind, you know, or like Claudio Simonetti and Goblin doing the Suspiria soundtrack, like stuff like that. I don't know that I think of Pino Donaggio, but he did a good job.
I feel I don't have enough closure on this, so we're just going to have to jump ahead. So let's talk the studio a little bit. There's always one fun fact, right, about any of these publishers or distributors.
Yeah, I just pulled this just before we started recording here. So
United Artists was the distributor of this film.
So they were the distributor, not the production company. So again, I think it was like a producer or maybe a group of producers that put together their $1 million for this movie to get made, and then they made $33 million back. But United Artists did the distributing. This company was started in 1919. Here's the thing we don't remember anymore because we're just so used to seeing the UA logo in front of films. When United Artists was first started, the premise was that it was going to allow actors to control their own interests in the films.
The artists that would be united were the actors. It's kind of great.
Yeah. And then it got bought and sold and restructured, and all these different corporations took parts of it out. And by the time this movie came out, United Artists was owned by a company called Transamerica. And Transamerica was pissed off because 2 movies distributed by United Artists got X ratings, Midnight Cowboy and Last Tango in Paris.
Now let's drop in a quick little history of the X rating. All right?
Yeah.
Very simply, the Motion Picture Association of America came up with the rating system, and for whatever reason, they didn't trademark the X rating.
Yeah, and so there are several films that got the X rating applied to them that are not how we think of X nowadays.
Because X was taken and used as this is an X-rated movie, triple X. That became it's pornographic or just it was like an advertisement. I still don't know. This would be a good story for us to track down finally. Why it is that X got scooped up and R didn't, but I guess maybe the trademarks came after it had been sort of
I wrote about this
exploited.
a long time ago for Brain Stuff, and I can't remember the answer. But there is an article floating around out there with my byline on it that answers this.
Well, I should track that down. So eventually, X became what we know now as, oh yeah, that's porn, and NC-17 is the new, extrememely limited, totally adult. Don't take your kids to it ever kind of rating.
Ironically, you know what other movie had an X rating? RoboCop.
Yeah, that's right. Well, they had to cut out like a couple things. Mm-hmm. So Midnight Cowboy and Last Tango in Paris got the X rating, and that kind of doomed them because that spelled porn. And so then Transamerica had a little corporate freak out.
Yeah, so the parent company of UA was like, well, we don't want to be involved in this. We don't want our name associated with these X-rated films in any way. So they had their names removed from the front of the films and the credits, and then they had their name taken off all the marketing, like all the posters and things like that. But then in 1978, so just after Carrie comes out, so there's like this conflict broiling throughout the 70s between United Artists and Transamerica. And in 1978, the executives at United Artists are like, you know what? Fuck this. And they they have a big blowout with Transamerica, and they storm out of the office, quit, and they all go and form Orion Pictures with money from Warner Brothers. So that's how we got Orion. And United Artists, kept going along. Transamerica just hired more people to fill those seats.
Of course they did.
But like, it goes to say, it shows you like sort of the mindset that was going on when De Palma is putting together this film, and he's like, oh yeah, like it's going to have all kinds of nudity in it, and like Nancy Allen giving blowjobs and all these things, that you wouldn't. I'd be real curious now to see these other versions of Carrie and to see how graphic they are, actually.
Yeah. I'm thinking of The Deuce right now, and obviously a fictional narrative, right? But it implies that there was a moment when the mainstreaming of porn and sexuality and all that was inevitable. Here it comes, right? Mm-hmm. But then this, like 1978, leading into 1980, the sort of the crackdown. It's almost like, there was a moment when the wave almost crested, but then it broke, right? And Carrie was near the end of that.
Yeah, yeah. And ostensibly, the idea behind the partnership with UA was that, like, it wasn't an independent film studio, but it was supposed to be treating artists with respect.
Yeah, but imagine the situation in 1919, right?
Yeah, exactly. All right, so this movie made its money back and then some. So It was supposed to be 1.6 million. They threw another 0.2 million on top of it at the end to help.
They scraped together another $200,000.
Yeah.
You know what I'm going to do right now while we're talking? I want
inflation.
Yeah, I'm going to do the inflation calculator, and you can talk about the other stuff that we've got on the notes.
So because they had so little money, they couldn't shoot all the scenes that were in the script. So that's why some of the stuff didn't make it into the film. But then the movie comes out, and it's so successful, its domestic total gross is $33.8 million. So that's like almost like 30 times what they put into it. Like, it's a crazy amount of money. And it has scored very well over the years in terms of reviews. Rotten Tomatoes has an aggregate of 93% approval based on 60 reviews. Metacritic score, which we always, categorize as being lower than Rotten Tomatoes in terms of like how they do the math. They gave it an 85 out of 100, but that's based on 14 reviews.
Now, we can say, just to jump back to the money real quick, you can multiply those figures by about 4 to get today's dollars.
Wow. Okay. So this would be like $8 million production budget.
Yeah,
nowadays,
and made $120 to $140 million.
So this is interesting because recently on the show, you and I have been talking about the differences in the modern film industry between like quote unquote indie movies that have like somewhere around under or $1 million as a budget, and then there's no middle room anymore. And then it just like jumps to like $10 million plus or $50 million plus. Like a movie like this might not get made nowadays because the budget was like in that weird nebulous middle zone.
It would get made on Kickstarter.
Maybe, yeah. Or a streaming service.
Exactly, yeah. Although I do wonder, right now, since Netflix is getting ready to compete against Disney, would Carrie get made on Netflix? Would Carrie get made on Hulu? Or would Amazon be like, oh, yeah, we got all these other Stephen King adaptations. Why don't you do a pornographic adaptation of his first book?
That's tough to say because Netflix is definitely doubling down. We're recording this in October of 2018. They're doubling down on independent horror movies right now. Like, and not just that, but like their own horror content, right? Because I think Stranger Things was such a success for them. They're grabbing every foreign television show that's like a thriller. Right.
And the place I was coming from is I was just thinking about how they've been canceling the Marvel stuff. They've been sort of like, in my mind, the corporation Netflix has been kind of hunkering down and preparing for battle.
They are, but I think in a different way.
But of course, it's not that they're going to stop making some stuff or stop trying things. They are going to go against Disney's brand.
Right. Yeah. So that's why you've got things like The Haunting of Hill House being so successful, or the Sabrina remake that's coming out in the next week or two. Stuff like that. Like they're really getting their fingers into like the genre pie, right? Like a lot of the directors that you and I have been talking about from the last like 5 or 6 years that are doing really well end up going to Netflix and making their own movies, right? Like the newest Jeremy Saulnier movie is a Netflix movie.
It's interesting to think. So actually, if Carrie had never been adapted in some other world and its time was finally coming around and Netflix grabbed it, it would probably be a Riverdale Chilling Adventures of Sabrina connected series, right?
It could, yeah. Who knows? Or they would do like a, the thing we need to keep in mind is all those examples that I just gave you are based on pre-existing properties, right? So like, yes, there are like original horror movies that are on Netflix, but I don't know necessarily that they would get funded as easily as something that's like based on a comic book character with 50-year history or a Shirley Jackson novel that's already been adapted twice,
Right. Okay, well, if we come back out of that little diversion, so Carrie, it made its money back a lot, right? It did very well, despite being marketed like a B picture. And that was something that De Palma was pissed off at the time and still mentions in interviews about it now. He was angry that they said, hey, come watch this horror film. They didn't sort of give it what he thought it deserved in terms of validation.
I think he thought he was making like a smart Hitchcock thriller.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the slow motion in his locker room scene, it's clear that he thought he was making art.
Yeah. Yes. That's for sure. I bet he talked to Nancy Allen all about his art.
So Sissy Spacek and Piper Laurie both got nominated for Oscars. Now, does this ring true with you? It's one of the few horror films that got nominated for Academy Awards.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, most horror films that we think of nowadays as being classics, right? Or being like well shot or well acted or whatever, they're largely ignored.
Yeah.
You know, think about like The Exorcist or The Shining or, you know, I don't know. What's another one? Well, certainly Texas Chainsaw Massacre wasn't getting any awards, you know.
Yeah. So Carrie was ranked very high in the subgenre of horror films. And then the subgenre of Stephen King adaptations. It won awards from Fantastic Film Fest and the National Society of Film Critics. It was nominated for Golden Globe, Hugo, and a Saturn. That's interesting. That little sort of like nod towards science fiction and fantasy. You know, the telekinesis part.
You know what's also funny about that? Like, go back to our Hugo Awards episode and like all of the consternation over the various puppy groups,
right,
and then then you look 40 years ago at like what kind of things were getting nominated for Hugos, and Carrie would be something that those dudes would hate nowadays.
You think so?
Well, they may hate it in the same way that De Palma did, in that they're like, oh, this is such a feminist parable. Show me more boobs, you know, like that kind of thing. But I think that it, you know, would be categorized as like, why are you getting your identity politics into my horror? You know, that kind of thing.
Okay, before we continue down that thread, let me just mention there's a bunch of sort of orbiting adaptations around this one. It was remade, or I guess Carrie was adapted again in 2002 on television, in 2013 as the movie you mentioned before. And then there was a sequel in 99 called The Rage, Carrie 2.
When I went to go watch this last night, both the 2002 television version and the sequel from 1999 are streaming on Amazon Prime.
Okay.
I've
never seen any of those.
I don't think I can work it up to watch it.
I'm not interested.
Yeah.
Although I would like, come Halloween next year, I would like to do the 2013 Carrie as our Super King context.
We can circle back around again. That sounds cool.
Yeah. And also, never heard of this ever before. In 1988, it was made into a Broadway musical.
Yeah. What?
And at least one actor from the movie was in that musical.
Oh, yeah? Who? Do you know?
I think it was the woman who played Collins.
Oh. What's her name? Because she's in Preacher. She was in Cats, too. What's her name? Let me look
Well, everyone was in Cats.
Cast listing. It's Betty Buckley. Betty Buckley, because I've been watching Preacher lately, and when she showed up in this, I was like, oh, wow, I recognize her. And yeah, she's known for doing a lot of stuff on stage like Cats and Sunset Boulevard. But yeah, she's the nice teacher in this.
Well, you want to put an asterisk on that nice?
She was nice for 1976. She slaps the shit out of Nancy Allen, which probably turned you on.
How about no comment?
So let's move on to representation, Charlie, and talk about how this movie treats women.
Yeah, grossly, and in a way that I recognize far too much as something that I liked when I was a kid, which I know I said that before, but I just want to say it again. Like it rubbed me both the wrong way and the right way this time round.
Yeah, you might want to change the metaphor from rubbing to something else.
Exactly what I want to point out. Yes,
but yeah, I mean, like I think I felt the same way. Although I was really like keenly aware of like how the camera just like drifted on the girls, and like the scene where Betty Buckley slaps Nancy Allen. Actually, 5 minutes of this movie is dedicated towards a montage of the teacher making all of the girls do push-ups and jumping jacks.
Yeah, with the same camera motion as in the locker room scene when they're naked. So it's like it connects the sort of voyeuristic display of the women with the display of their discipline, right?
Yeah.
Ending in both ways with this sort of climactic slap from a surrogate mother figure.
So there are a couple different articles I pulled on this. I imagine, I wasn't able to find any academic stuff for this, but I imagine out there've got to be like half a dozen to more theses and dissertations about like Carrie's, impact on the feminist movement or its relationship to the male gaze or, final girl syndrome, all these kinds of things. Here's a quote from Adam Neville, who is actually a guy who just had one of his books adapted into a Netflix original horror movie.
Okay.
The Ritual, which just came out this year and is quite good, is based on one of his novels. He says about Carrie, the structure and the voice feel radical, and the characterization of Carrie by a male writer remains startling. So at the time... So
this is the novel. This is talking about the novel first.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that carries over into the translation for film, right? Like the idea like, oh, a man was capable of thinking about a girl on her period.
So this is it's the, are you there, God? It's me, Margaret, of horror films.
Well, I mean, how do you mean? Because that was a woman.
Well, what I'm saying, I'm making a very ironic joke. Once again, just because something is not completely ludicrous and dismissive of something about women does not make it a feminist text.
Yeah, right. So, and let's preface this by saying you and I are not exactly experts or the right people to be commenting on what is or is not feminist. But
that's right. Our idea of feminism does come from a kind of
from this
broadly unschooled, well, not from this, but from a broadly unschooled vision of feminism as the push for women to be treated equally, culturally, sociologically, and economically.
Yeah. So De Palma, for all the male gaze that we see in this film, there's a reason for it. Like he has a bad reputation behind the scenes, and his quote misogyny is definitely something that's like a known quality in Hollywood, right? So apparently on the set of this movie, he had a reputation for, quote, slightly heartless perfectionism, and he would just be mean to the cast, essentially. He purposely kept Spacek isolated, which, they say that's a standard tactic. They wanted to make it easier for the other actresses to gang up on her. But he was purposely trying to elicit emotional reactions by like turning the cast against one another.
Now, I should point out that we have to take that with a grain of salt because we have one of the stars explaining that Spacek came to them and said, this is what I'm going to do.
That's so true, but it also makes you wonder, did De Palma tell her to do that?
Absolutely, yeah. De Palma might have said, hey, this is what you need to do. But what that means is that even if he was the one doing it, Spacek presented it in a way that made sense and worked for her.
Yeah. Oh, here's a note about the scene that we were just talking about.
Yeah.
The scene in which Miss Collins slaps Chris, that's a real slap, and she was made to deliver it repeatedly until Nancy Allen was on the verge of tears. Let's pause for a second. This man made another woman repeatedly slap his future wife until she cried.
Yeah. And Nancy Allen even says, I guess he didn't trust me to give the right performance. He wanted to see something for real.
Yeah.
And that to me, that's the real core of, if we're talking about misogyny, although maybe really what it is good old-fashioned sexism.
I don't think De Palma thought of himself as being misogynist or sexist. I think he genuinely thought like, oh, I'm making this like smart thriller, right?
Yeah.
And he didn't even think about his gender constructions.
Right. But what he did expect is that to get what he wanted, the women had to hit each other. They couldn't act it for him.
Well, and then he needed to beat them up too. So PJ Souls got a ruptured eardrum from the scene where they knocked her down with the high-pressure hose.
Ugh.
So he apparently shot that repeatedly as well, and PJ Souls talks about that. But for all of his like, oh, I didn't want to bury Sissy Spacek in fake rocks because I don't want to be that guy. He's like having these women beat the shit out of each other and shooting them with high pressure hoses, you know?
De Palma's direction, though, is a weird mix of let's do some actual physical damage to get exactly what I want out of this, and also an openness to influence from the female actors, right?
Yeah.
Mostly in Piper Laurie, who might have been older than him at that time. There might have been a little weird mom thing going on for him.
This is bizarre and crazy obvious when you watch the film now. So the scene at the end where Carrie crucifies Piper Laurie to the wall with all these knives from the kitchen. Every time a knife hits Piper Laurie, she makes a sound as if she's having sex. She makes these orgasm sounds. She doesn't sound like she's being killed. She sounds like she's enjoying it.
Right. That she's taking on the true the true mortification of the self.
And that was all Piper Laurie. She apparently had input down to that. That was her idea to make those noises. And here's another note here. So De Palma timed the storyboarding in his movies quite comprehensively. We talked about this. So the rapturous slow motion shot through the girls' locker room to where Carrie is showering, quote, achieves a dreamlike eroticism, then mirrored later with the even more ecstatic scene of her prom coronation.
So let's just raise out of that language real quick and say it flat out. This movie takes violence and sex, conflates them, and then also
fetishizes them.
Yeah, and fetishizes the build up to that, and fetishizes the kind of sexism or infantilization of women, right?
Yeah,
that is in the story.
And Vulture magazine did an interview with PJ Soles about all of her work in this movie and in Halloween and in later films. And she said, so they straight up say to her, Brian De Palma has a reputation for being a misogynist. He's denied this. Do you think he was? How do you think he got that reputation? And PJ Soles, she's like, whoa, I don't want to. This is pre-Me Too. She's like, I don't want to talk about this. He says, I get it. In most of his movies, the woman is toyed with and is definitely treated as a sex symbol and then gets it in the end. But I don't know what he's personally into.
Weird language. And she also says, I wouldn't say he treated the guys any differently than the girls. Which is interesting. Like, he might have been personally the same or directorially the same.
Yeah, this is what I mean. I don't think he thought about what it was going on.
In the movie itself, it's obvious that men and women are being treated differently by the eye or by the world building. And, now that I'm thinking about it, like, saying that Carrie is a feminist movie or a feminist story and then saying, but that's weird because of all this stuff that happens and how the movie was made. It is interesting to think that this story could have been done in a completely different way, a different aesthetic, say by two women writing and directing. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that story would have the same power and would resonate the same way. Right. And by power, I mean, it would be very affecting, the story of Carrie, who is a bullied girl, who is almost brought to some kind of salvation, but then has that taken away because someone can't let go of bullying her. Right. But you don't need a pornographic locker room shot to get there. You don't need, fetishized violence against women to get there. And so,
right.
It stays a feminist text, or it retains its feminist bent despite all the work that was put into making it a late 70s sexist entertainment.
So this actually is relevant 40 some odd years later to something that happened this week in entertainment.
Oh boy.
So Jason Blum, who runs Blumhouse, production company that makes a lot of low-budget horror movies that make a lot of money back, recently said in an interview, I think he was doing a press junket for the new Halloween, and he said in an interview, I'd love to hire more female directors, but there just aren't any female directors out there that are willing to do horror.
Oh my God, I saw that in a tweet.
Yeah. People latched onto it and rightfully so took him to task, because that's not at all true. Like, if you're actually paying attention to the field of movies that are coming out, the one person he was able to mention in the interview was the woman who directed The Babadook. And he's like, I've approached her over and over again, and she doesn't want to work with us. I don't know why. And it's like, well, maybe it's because she's the only woman that you're paying attention to. I think, I can't remember where this article was, but some company, maybe Vulture or Variety, did here's 13 female horror directors that Jason Blum could hire if he was paying attention,
Yeah.
There's lots of people out there, and yeah, they would have all probably done a very different version of Carrie.
It's funny. There's always those forms of, there aren't enough women interested in doing this thing. I can't find any. And it seems...
What's the Mitt Romney quote? I have
God.
Binders full of women.
Full of women. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. We could just stick with him being a vulture capitalist, and we wouldn't have to talk anything about how he's not good with words.
I've never heard that before. Vulture capitalist instead of venture capitalist? Or was that a faux pas?
No, not a faux pas at all. I mean, that is the pun that's been made by plenty of folks, where, venture capital, where instead of trying to get a company started, you buy a company, load it up with debt, and use it as kind of a bank or collateral for a while until you dissolve it. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So it is nothing's changed.
I swear to God, I don't know how we got to Mitt Romney in the middle of the Carrie episode.
Mittens is just always on my mind. So let's move on, though. There are some more quotes about this film. There's a piece that The Guardian published that has multiple film critics, but also female horror writers talking about Carrie.
So this was a retrospective. This was not contemporary.
Right, yeah. They talked to Serafina Kent Bathrick, and she says, like all the women in the film, Carrie brings on her own destruction, but she's also punished for being a woman. That's the weird thing about this story, right? Is at the end of the day, Piper Laurie's character is right. like all of the things that she says about the devil and what boys want, and they're all going to laugh at you. All that shit comes true.
Yeah, except what Piper Laurie does is she gives Carrie the story to live. It gives Carrie the story that she's going to understand what happens to her through, right?
Yeah, yeah. So then journalist Brianna Wu, who I think we've cited on the show before, she chimes in about this, and she says, actually, horror is one of the only genres in film where women get to be the star and they can have rich emotional lives. This is true about Carrie, not only about Carrie herself, but all the main characters who are women.
That's right. Carrie, the movie Carrie passes the Bechdel test with flying colors.
Yeah. It does. I guess I'd never thought about it that way, but yeah, you're right.
And just to make that explicit, so the Bechdel test is essentially saying, are the women in a movie only there to view a male hero and, support or validate what the movie has to say about the male hero?
There is, however, it passes, but barely. I mean, most of the conversations are about boys and how the women relate to the boys, right? Like whether it's the teacher talking to Carrie or whether it's the other girls making fun of Carrie or even her friend, it's all like, well, does a boy like you or does he not?
Yeah. I mean, maybe by the percentages, but the fundamental conflicts, right?
Yeah.
Are Carrie and her mom talking about how one should live your life. The teacher and the bullies, how one should treat women, right? And then, so I hear you that the way that women relate to men is a big part, but it's less that, oh, hey, Carrie, what do you think of John Travolta?
Right,
it's not a construction to then talk about a male hero.
Well, the Guardian piece goes on to say that Carrie as a film, in contrast, all of the women in it are acting, plotting, rescuing, and ultimately killing each other. right? So like,
right, they make decisions that affect other people's lives without having to ask a man or a boy to help them explain it, right?
Wu goes on to say about horror films that it's a world where money can't save you, privilege can't save you, and strength can't save you. So in some ways, it's a world with, quote, real equality. Okay. I mean, I think there's something interesting going on there, and there's a lot more to unpack in terms of like gender roles in this that I think than you and I are capable of doing on our own. But this is definitely like a conflicted film when it comes to how it views women.
Yeah, let's talk about that real quick. What you said about what we're not quite capable of doing, because I did notice that something was very very explicit to me. So I read the quote, like all the women in the film, she brings on her own destruction. She is punished for being a woman, right?
Yeah.
And my first thought is, that doesn't seem right. You know? And I immediately thought, oh, if I get into some kind of point for point refutation of that, like I'm trying to make it clear that I think that's wrong and here's all the stuff, I would probably find myself in a sort of a self-created logical failure, right? Or a self-created cultural trap. Is that what you mean by maybe we're not qualified to delve into this stuff?
Well, I would also add on top of it just that like we've already established you and I are raised in a male-dominated entertainment-based culture, right? Like a patriarchal culture. And this was the kind of shit that we grew up with. And so like our idea of what we think is us understanding gender roles is constructed already, right?
Right.
Our idea of like, oh, no, I'm progressive is like the same as Brian De Palma's.
We progress from what, right? Like,
yeah.
Oh, we've managed to stop being regressive, so that must be progressive.
Yeah, and like no matter how self-aware we may or may not be, we're going to have blind spots when it comes to being able to like actually critique this stuff.
So before we get too deep into identity and themes and how we relate to them and how it seems other people do, let's talk about all that media that we consumed. Right?
Yeah. So since this is just for Patreons, let's do some actual recommendations. We won't break them out into a mini-sode.
So what does this movie make you think that other people should watch?
Definitely Badlands.
Yeah.
We talked about that already. So that is a great movie if you want to see Sissy Spacek at, the height of her power again, although she's always at the height of her power. Badlands is a fantastic film. And then I also mentioned Phantom of the Paradise. I don't know if I would call that a good film, but like I think it's such a bizarre, just out there movie. I think everybody needs to see it, especially like if you have an idea of who you think Brian De Palma is.
Okay.
That's a weird movie. And then, there's been a number of films over the last 4 decades that have come back to the themes of Carrie, not just remade Carrie, but like have done the like, okay, let's take on adolescence for young women in the horror genre. And there's 2 movies that stuck out to me that are interesting. I think they take this a step further. I don't know necessarily that either of them were made by women. Let me see. So the first is Ginger Snaps, which is a 2000 horror film that was directed by a guy and written by him and a woman named Karen Walton. But it's a werewolf story, but it's like an adolescent werewolf story. Do you know anything about Ginger Snaps?
I have heard about it, but I've never seen it.
Okay. And then the other one is a movie called Teeth, which I think is streaming. It might be on Netflix right now. It is also written and directed by a dude.
But is that the one about vagina? What is it? Detente? Is that the Latin for teeth? Dentata. Thank you.
Dentata. So, the premise of Teeth is that this girl hits puberty and she finds out that she has fangs inside her vagina. And so every time a guy tries to have sex with her and treats her horribly, she ends up biting part of his body off. And then she just sort of embraces it throughout the movie. Yeah, it's a weird movie. And again, I don't know how quote feminist it actually is, but it's a interesting film to go back to and see, like, okay, well, how far did we progress with this idea?
I haven't seen it. All I know about it is what you just said, but I will say that does not sound like female empowerment so much as it sounds like male terror.
Right, yeah. It's gruesome, but it's also like played as a comedy in a lot of ways. It's been a long time since I've seen it. The last time I saw it was when it came out. Like, I saw it in the theater. I have one other one, just came out this month, actually, and it's a comic book. Chelsea Kane, who I think that I've talked about on the show recently, she is doing a comic book series with an all-female creative team, like the artist, letterers, I think colorist, everybody. And it's called Man-Eaters. And the premise is that when, in this world that Kane has created, when girls hit puberty, they can potentially turn into werecats and go on these like crazy like annihilation sprees where they like, you know, kill a bunch of people. And so everybody's aware of it in the society, and there's like so much more of a stigma placed on
how
women.
You deal with it. Okay.
Yeah.
So is all of this coming from the idea of the revenge of Carrie? Is that kind of what threads through Ginger Snap's teeth and Man-Eaters for you?
I think all of them have that same idea of like, during adolescence, women are struggling with their identity and their bodies. And then the horror aspect is, well, what if they were also a werewolf or a werecat or had teeth in their vagina or whatever, right?
So the thing about my experience with this is that I don't have the horror movies in my head. So Carrie doesn't like remind me of that other movie where the telekinetic person kills a bunch of people, or the other movie where someone's drenched in blood. For me, it's much more like I think of the Brian De Palma movies that I think are really good. So that is Blowout, which did not get the love it deserved when it first happened.
And that's Nancy Allen's in that one?
Yep. John Travolta and Nancy Allen are actually in that one.
Ugh.
Untouchables. Well, go easy, Tiger. The Untouchables, great. Scarface, great. And then I have to admit, I have a certain affection for Raising Cain.
Okay.
It's got John Lithgow in it.
It's been a long time since I don't think I ever saw it, but I remember like the trailer maybe. Yeah.
It is.
Was Raising Cain like he had multiple personalities?
Not exactly. It is as if someone was parodying Brian De Palma. But it's Brian De Palma.
Okay. Man, for you, it seems like the perfect movie would star William Hurt and be directed by Brian De Palma.
I'm sure there is one, isn't there?
I don't know.
Got to look that up after this.
Yeah.
Also, a thing that the whole Carrie relationship with her mother and the sort of the Stephen Kingness of all of this makes me think of. You ever see the movie Snow Angels?
No.
Has Sam Rockwell in it and Kate Beckinsale, right? Who I have only really seen fetishized in horror movies, except for this movie too, right?
Wait a minute. This movie was directed by the guy who just remade Halloween, David Gordon Green.
And I'm getting there. You've busted in on my recommendation by pulling it up on the internet.
Sorry, go ahead.
So thinking about Halloween, right? And thinking about his weird, David Gordon Green's weird kind of march towards genre, right? It kind of, it can reactivate his earlier movies in a way. It's like, oh, this is where he was going. Mm-hmm. But Sam Rockwell and Kate Beckinsale are the parents, separated parents of a young girl. Something fucking horrible happens, and then a whole bunch more of horrible things happen after that. It's based on a Stuart Onan novel, and he's great too, but we'll leave that for later. There's just something about like the small town and the way people sort of regulate others' behavior. Mm-hmm. That's all through Snow Angels. And then the added bonus of horror films happening now and all that. Like it makes me think of that movie. It's
So I want to
really
make
good, but it's really hard to watch.
I want to make a quick observation, and you tell me whether or not this makes any sense to you. Okay.
Okay.
All of the films I just mentioned related to Carrie, not counting the ones that are just like directed by and starring people who are similar to it, but are from the perspective of the young women,
Right.
the children. And the movie you just recommended sounds like it is from the perspective of the parents.
Yeah, specifically the mom.
Yeah. So that's interesting, right? Like there's a different approach, I think, when it's like the horror doesn't belong to the teenager anymore. It belongs to the parents and their fear for their teenager.
Yeah, like I don't think of myself like, well, I'm a parent now. I'm so much more mature than kids, right? That's not my self-image, but my attention and my sympathy and my terror have all moved from something bad might happen to me to something bad might happen to my family.
But from your perspective, I'm not saying this, but that this one movie, it's easier for you to identify maybe with narratives that are about how bad it is for the parent than it is for how bad it is for the kid themselves.
Yeah, that might be true.
That's interesting. I never really thought about that in terms of like how these types of stories are framed and who the audience is.
I'm thinking about it too now. Although I will say it's not like I looked at Piper Laurie in this movie and said, well,
Right.
It really does feel like maybe Carrie should have listened to her. Like, I don't feel that.
Yeah, maybe Carrie needed to spend more time in the closet. No, but hey, did your wife watch this movie with you when you rewatched it?
No.
Really? No. All right. I was thinking this might be one that she'd be willing to cross the horror line for.
It never even came up. She was doing a conference, and this was a late night watch all by myself.
Okay. As all Brian De Palma movies are meant to be
They
for
must be
dads.
Yeah.
Gross.
I tell you, folks, if you don't know about Brian De Palma, you might be better off. But you could certainly, you could go down a hell of a rabbit hole if you started watching Brian De Palma movies and then intercutting them with the Hitchcock movies. Like if you watch Dressed to Kill and then Psycho and then Body Double and then Vertigo and then Femme Fatale and like To Catch a Thief, which not exactly, but you could be like, what the hell is this guy doing?
Right.
Who is this monster De Palma?
The more I learned about the Nancy Allen relationship in relationship to this film, and
Right.
like one of the actresses was talking about the blowjob scene, and they were saying like, oh, I think Nancy purposely played it up in that scene to get Brian's attention. Like a lot of people thought she was flirting with Travolta on set, but I always was under the impression that she was purposely trying to turn on De Palma.
All right, and
And
let's
it's like,
remember that
whoa,
1970
this is
wasn't
gross.
Right, 1970 wasn't bad just for the women. Right, it was bad for everybody.
Well, also, like, think about that scene. Like, Travolta slaps her, like, 3 times in that scene. Like, they go back and forth in the car where, like, she's mean to him, and then he hits her, and then she calls him a stupid shit. And it's like, they go over and over through that until it leads to sex. It's such a horrible depiction of relationships in the 70s.
Yeah, welcome to BDP.
So, okay, yeah, we'll have to dive further into the Brian De Palma world at some point, or maybe not.
So let's talk about, there's like the caricatures in this movie, right? One of the reasons I think it's so popular or so successful is because it is like operatic, right? It's like insane the level that these very simple things reach, like religious abuse, right? Bullying, right? Adolescence confusion. These are all things that in this movie become supercharged.
Well, they're also all things that I think we could categorize as tropes of Stephen King, right? Like
for
these
sure.
are things that come up over and over and over again in his work, especially like the fundamentalist religious person as villain, and almost like a 2-dimensional caricature.
Right. A manipulative villain that sets everything on a path to destruction.
Yeah.
I also realized rewatching Carrie that pretty much everything I know about bullying as a as a phenomenon, right, comes from Stephen King. I had a bully in grade school. I had someone who made me their project, and for 4 years, I got pretty regular abuse from this person. But they didn't, pull out a switchblade and try and carve their initial into my stomach, and they didn't cover me in blood, and they didn't do whisper campaigns. They were just shitty to me whenever they could be. But I understood bullying to be what was in the Stephen King books. Ace Merrill, right? Who would eventually kill you from what he was doing.
Right.
That's how I understood bullying.
Me too. I think that's another thing that I took away from the Stephen King context of growing up during this time, right? Although I was also bullied. I don't know if I could say worse than you were, but I was bullied to a later age than you were. I was bullied up until through my senior year of high school.
That's
and I dealt with physical violence related to it, but not like where you're going with this. Not to the point where I was like, oh, someone's going to kill me.
I expected to get the shit kicked out of me in high school because I read Stephen King.
Right. Yeah. And so I think it's fair to say, and this actually comes from one of the articles about Carrie, that part of the appeal of this movie is that that's a universal story, right? That a lonely kid trying to fit in and dealing with bullies is something like pretty much everybody can identify with, maybe even somebody who was a bully.
Yeah, because that's the other side of it, right? This is how bullies can kind of relate to this stuff. Everybody knows about a person that they need to just not connect with.
Right.
We think about toxic people, as adults. We think about toxic people like, I'm not going to let that person into my life to screw up everything I've got going.
Mm-hmm.
Well, kids have that too, right? Unfortunately, it takes a very particular, or not a particular, but it takes a lot less to trigger the kid's sensation of, well, as King says, the wavelength only other kids can pick up, which broadcasts strange, not like us, keep away.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely remember that vibe, both directed at me and my friends and I directing it at other kids.
Yeah.
Thinking oh, that kid is so alien.
Yeah, we don't think that we're doing something terrible if we just exclude someone because we're not throwing rocks at them.
Right. Yeah. So I am going to inevitably bring this back to this ongoing theme that we seem to have because of both where we are right now in place and time, but also how this film and a lot of the other pop culture that we are consuming or looking at for the show relates to right now. This is yet another parable from the 70s and 80s that is, hey, bullies are the bad people, these self-involved, conceited assholes who only care about their own looks and their status and money. They are the real villains. And here we are in 2018, and we're seeing that manifested on the political stage in real time.
Yeah, let me flip that for you. I think that maybe the trouble is that instead of those movies saying, hey, look, the bullies are the bad guys. This is, they're the ones who should be punished.
Mm-hmm.
What those movies really acted as were a reminder, hey, when you mistreat the loner and the outcast, it actually hurts someone.
Mm-hmm.
It was sort of look, Carrie, whose life is destroyed by bullying.
It allows you to be able to sympathize with somebody who you thought of as alien.
Right. It's just, hey, have a little empathy. But also, it's like you said, it was sort of a joke, but sort of true. Piper Laurie was right. Well, also, the kids were right. Carrie was dangerous. Carrie was different. Carrie was weird. And so in a way, these movies about how bullies suck, actually most of the time just humanize bullies or humanize the bullied.
Well, right. So, I mean, one of the things that I noticed for the first time rewatching this film as an adult was all of these kids are super fucked up. But like Nancy Allen and John Travolta, the scenes with them in the car driving around and like interacting with each other, it's like so obvious from their dialogue that they're a product of their upbringing.
Oh, and you know what it made me realize? And I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
Well, I'm not. But I know I interrupted you, and we'll get back to you. It made me think about how people talk about that couple in the first season of Stranger Things that are so screwed up. Steve's friends are like, insanely weird and insanely awful.
And they're the popular kids. But
they're John Travolta and Nancy Allen.
Totally. Yeah, like the scene, I mean, this is just a scene that establishes character. It doesn't even really push the plot. But they're like driving around town and John Travolta's drinking a beer. And like the way he drinks beer in the car is by just like splashing his face with beer. And then like she is just like, self-involved in doing her makeup while he's driving. And then like when he slams on the brakes, she gets mad at him, not because he was protecting their safety, but because her makeup got messed up.
Right.
These are all like traits that we think of as like, oh, you're the self-involved, horrible human being. I don't want to have anything to do with you.
And yet, Seinfeld was an incredibly popular sitcom because we could mock these horrible people. These horrible, selfish people.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's just a couple steps from Nancy Allen and John Travolta being crappy to each other in a car to the way that the Seinfeld stars snipped at each other on the television, where we, again, are trying to humanize sort of the awfulness that seems to be in a lot of people.
But I don't know... I don't know if these fictional attempts to humanize them have done us any good, because now we've got these people that are ostensibly like these characters running things, whether it's our corporations or our government, right? Like these just kind of vain, awful people, bullies in a lot of senses, are like pulling the strings.
Yeah.
And I don't know that that's any different than it was in 1976, right? But it's like so much more obvious now because they're more flagrant about it, but we've, again, like consumed this steady diet of bully fiction. You've been listening to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How it's made and how it informs our everyday culture.
Our theme music is Human Factor by Mile Marker.
And right now you're listening to Drive Fast by 3 Chain Links.
Show notes and all our past episodes are available at supercontextpodcast.libsyn.com.
You can email the show at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com to tell us what you like, what you don't like, and to suggest topics for future shows.
And I'm available on Twitter as @Christian Sager.
And I'm there @Bennett Radio. 2 N's, 2 T's.